Hey guys, tonight, we're slipping into the cloistered shadows of a medieval monastery, where monks hum ancient chants, and the air smells faintly of warm bread beeswax, and something just a bit boozy. Picture it. High stone walls, candlelight flickering across manuscripts, and tucked behind a nondescript wooden door, bubbling quietly in thick oak barrels, is something far less austere than you'd expect beer. Not just any beer, but holy beer, brewed in silence by hooded men who take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But evidently, not sobriety. As you tiptoe through the cold corridors in your imagination, the soft shuffle of your sandals echoes on worn flagstones. You're not supposed to be here, not in this part of the abbey. This is where the lay brothers work, where fermentation hums behind ancient doors, and a fine mist of hops lingers in the air, like a monk's perfume. And just so we're clear, you probably wouldn't survive a week here. Not because of spiritual hardship, but because medieval hygiene is basically a fever dream with plumbing that's either non-existent or a cosmic joke. You'd be praying for penicillin by day 2, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a damp garden path, past beds of herbs, sage mugwort wormwood medicinal and mystical in equal measure. The vines twist up against crumbling stone fragrant with purpose. This isn't a place of leisure. It's survival, sanctity, and schedule. Everything here has a rhythm bells, tolling every few hours, the clink of pewter mugs, the scratching of quills. Time is sacred, even if it's measured in barley mash. You enter the brewing chamber. There's no roaring furnace, just a subdued fire pit, and steam rising from a copper cauldron, the size of a baptismal font. A monk's sleeves rolled stirs with a wooden paddle, longer than your arm. He doesn't speak, doesn't need to. His lips move in silent prayer, or maybe he's just counting the rotations. Historians still argue whether these early brewing techniques were methodical science or ritualized guesswork. Either way, the result is drinkable, often delicious, occasionally lethal. The abbey has reasons for this odd vocation. Water, for starters. The stuff in the streams carries more than the Holy Spirit. Brewing beer was less about revelry and more about not dying of dysentery. Monks being educated and oddly good at keeping things alive. Yeast included ended up ahead of the curve. Here you squat beside a barrel and notice carvings not of saints, but of sun symbols and harvest spirals. Fringe historians claim monks encoded pagan fermentation symbols into their barrelwork remnants of older brewing cults. Maybe. Or maybe Brother Marcus was just bored one night and had a chisel. The scent in the room is thick, bready sour with hints of smoke and wildflowers. It's the kind of smell that makes your mouth water and your eyes droop. If dreams had flavor, this one would taste like spiced grain and wood smoke. You blink slowly as the monk ladles out a cloudy sample into a rough ceramic cup and hands it to you. You sip. It's warm, flat, and tastes faintly of herbs you can't name. But it's strangely comforting. It's not intoxicating in the modern sense. The alcohol content is low, more like a hearty broth than a brew. But your body relaxes. Your mind softens. This is a drink of fasting and reflection. A humble loophole in the world of strict monastic discipline. You wonder who figured that out first. Who dared raise their hand and say, Abbot, I think this counts as food. In the background, the rhythm of the abbey continues. Bells ring for Compline, the final prayer of the day. Outside, the sun has dipped low, casting long shadows across the cloister. The monks file in 2 by 2, solemn and slow. One of them brushes past you, smells faintly of malt and incense, and disappears into the chapel. The brewing continues silent as always, timeless as the stone around it. You linger watching the last of the day's light flicker on the brass fittings and the rounded bellies of barrels stacked like slumbering monks. There's a kind of holiness in this room, different from the chapel's gold and smoke. It's quieter, more honest, maybe more human, and somewhere in the distance, in a world far beyond these monastery walls, the sound of a tavern echoes with laughter. But not here. Here beer is not for merriment. It's for survival, for sanctity, for keeping the vows, by bending them ever so slightly. You wake not from sleep, but from the trance of warm, barley-scented air and flickering lamplight, and find yourself now moving through the monastery's scriptorium. Ink scratches gently as monks copy old texts by hand. But you're not here for scripture tonight. You're chasing thirst. Not the spiritual kind, but something grainier. You pass through the library shelves, groaning under dusty vellum and cracked bindings, and push open a creaky door to the refectory, where monks sit in silence eating simple meals. Water is poured sparingly. Instead, each wooden cup holds a familiar cloudy liquid, beer. Because here, beer is not indulgence. It's necessity. You see, back in the Middle Ages, water wasn't your friend. Drinking from a stream was like spinning a roulette wheel. With every sip, your prize might be a mild thirst quencher, or it might be dysentery cholera, or any number of invisible horrors. In a world before filtration boiling, or Brita pitchers, people turned to fermentation for safety. Monks already practicing basic hygiene, and with time to observe the effects of their habits, noticed something remarkable. Those who drank beer got sick far less often, and so the sacred thirst began. Not for intoxication, but for life. You sit now beside a novice monk in training, Brother Linus. He's young, still nervously adjusting his robe, but he knows why he's here. Water kills, he mutters without looking up. Beer doesn't. He has a point. The brewing process involved boiling water killing pathogens, and fermentation helped preserve the liquid longer. Beer became liquid bread, nourishing, portable, and blessedly low risk. Plus, it was calorically dense, making it perfect for monks who fasted regularly, which, as it turns out, was often. Historians still argue whether the monks truly viewed beer as a health drink, or if that explanation conveniently arrived later. Either way, their brewing methods worked, and their communities thrived. The idea spread first between abbeys, then into secular society. But here, in this dining hall, where silence reigns, no one drinks for joy. This is beer, as sustenance, not celebration. You take a sip. It's thicker than you expect, like liquid porridge, with a hint of sourness. This isn't the golden pilsner of your local tap room. This is a cloudy, yeasty, rustic brew that fills your belly and quiets your mind. You feel it settling in your core, a warm stone placed gently behind your ribs. On the wall nearby, a faded mural shows a saint holding what appears to be a drinking horn. Scholars have debated whether it's symbolic or literal. Was St. Arnold of Soissons truly the patron of brewing? Or did his image simply align with beer-loving monks looking for divine branding? Either way, His face appears often in these halls, and always with a smile. And here's something quirkier: some abbeys brewed multiple tiers of beer. There was strong beer for the important guests, and festivals middle beer for the monks themselves, and a weaker small beer for children and the poor. Yes, children. Because again, beer was safer than water, even for tiny monks in training. You stroll past the refectory into the gardens again, where hops twist upward around wooden trellises. Hops weren't always part of beer, you know. Early brews were flavored with groot, a mix of herbs like yarrow heather and bog myrtle. Some were mildly hallucinogenic. It wasn't until the 9th to 12th centuries that hops became the go-to not only for flavor, but also for their preservative qualities. The monks took to it quickly, not just because it made better beer, but because it made longer-lasting beer. Easier to transport, easier to store, easier, you might say, to spread the good word one flask at a time. You stop by a bench under a fig tree, the leaves casting lacework shadows across the stone path. A jug sits beside you, sweating slightly in the cool air. You lift it and pour another taste into a shallow bowl. The flavors are earthy and alive. Somewhere between grain and herb, between warmth and wildness, you can taste the centuries. Brother Linus reappears holding a tiny book. Inside are brewing notes, messy ink-blotted instructions, with margins filled with little drawings. A bird, a smiling sun, a half-finished fish. You smile. Not everything in the abbey is solemn. Sometimes even monks doodle. And then he whispers, "This one's for Lent. Thicker, stronger." You raise an eyebrow, because here's the loophole. During fasting periods, Lent Advent, certain feast eves, solid food was forbidden. But liquids, they didn't count. So the monks, ever resourceful, developed denser, richer beers. More calories, more grain, more meal in a mug, if you will. The logic was divine if you couldn't chew it. It wasn't cheating. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual innovation or gentle rebellion. But one thing's for sure, monks weren't starving during Lent. You tilt back your cup again and feel the warm brew roll across your tongue. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls long and low. Vespers, evening prayer. But your prayer tonight is quieter, a whispered thanks to centuries of silent brewers who filled their cups with patience, persistence, and just a dash of rule-bending creativity. You move now through a cloistered corridor lined with stone columns, each worn smooth by centuries of passing sandals. The evening wind slips in gently cool and sweet, tugging at your robe like a memory. Somewhere behind you, the last notes of a Gregorian chant are fading, replaced now by the familiar clatter of ceramic cups and the hiss of warm liquid meeting earthenware. It's beer time again, but this isn't indulgence. No, you're about to discover the most ingenious loophole in all of medieval monasticism: how monks turned beer into holy nutrition, cleverly sneaking sustenance through the gates of their fasting vows. Yes, tonight, you drink your dinner. It all begins with one brilliant idea: liquid bread. That's what the monks called it. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Beer, especially the thick, cloudy variety brewed in monasteries, was packed with calories, nutrients, and complex carbs. When you weren't allowed solid food, this hearty sludge of barley and yeast slid right under the spiritual radar. You sit now at a simple wooden bench in the brewing cellar. On the wall, an iron pot swings gently above the fire. Inside, grains boil and swirl, creating a heavy mash that smells like oatmeal wood smoke, and faintly of banana. Thank the yeast for that. A nearby monk lifts a lid from a wooden cask, labeled quadruple. He doesn't say much. He simply dips a ladle in and offers you a sample. It's darker than the last brew. Thicker. Sweet at first, then bitter like molasses married a raisin, and ran off to live in a barley silo. This is no table beer. This is Lent fuel. Historians still argue whether the monks were truly innocent in their invention of fasting beer, or whether it was an ecclesiastical version of gaming the system. Some sources suggest the monks even sent a sample of their beer to the Pope for approval. But the story goes that the beer spoiled on the long trip south. When the Holy Father sipped the rancid brew, he grimaced and declared, "If this is what they drink, let them have it." Thus papal approval was granted, under a very smelly misunderstanding. Back in the cellar, you run your fingers across the rim of the barrel. The wood is warm, breathing faint puffs of malty air. There's a little engraving here, too. 2 fish crossed beneath a loaf of bread. Another wink. Another loophole. Fasting. Oh, yes. But not starving. Brother Linus returns holding a tray of simple monk fare, black bread, dried apples, and of course another mug. This one's labeled Doppelbock. You lift it, and the aroma hits you like a velvet hammer prunes, caramel burnt sugar, maybe even a whiff of licorice. It's like the darkest of fruitcakes, only liquid and slightly judgmental. As you sip, the world slows again. The cellar is dimly lit by tallow candles. You can hear the slow drip of condensation off the barrel hoops and the soft crackle of firewood. This isn't just drinking. It's reflection. A ritual. The beer isn't gulped. It's sipped considered and swallowed like a psalm. Did all monks buy into this? Not quite. Some orders were stricter, interpreting no food as truly nothing with substance. Others embraced the flexibility. Benedictines, Cistercians, even Trappists later on. They all had varying degrees of enthusiasm for the spiritual buffet in a bottle. But make no mistake, beer was nourishment. Beer was medicine. Beer for monks was survival dressed in a brown robe. You step outside again, the night air cool on your cheeks. The moon rises over the abbey towers, casting long shadows through the garden. Somewhere nearby, an owl hoots once, and then falls silent. You follow a narrow path past the kitchen garden. Onions leaks maybe even a brave tomato, and end up beside the granary. Here the grain is stored, protected, precious. It's the lifeblood of the abbey, not just for bread and porridge, but for beer. Quaint detail, some abbeys calculated their beer rations down to the drop. A monk might receive a pint with breakfast, one with lunch, and another at dusk. 3 pints a day kept the doctor away, or the medieval version of one who probably prescribed leeches and repentance. There's even evidence that monks named their beers after the liturgical calendar. Fasten beer for Lent fest beer, for high holy days. Winter beer for when the snow kept everyone too sleepy to argue. These weren't just names. They were prayers in a mug, and yet, here's the real twist. This beer didn't make the monks slothful. If anything, it made them industrious. Brewing beer meant tracking temperature, timing ingredients, qualities already deeply embedded in monastic life. The precision needed for good beer mirrored the rhythm of monastic hours, vespers, matins, lauds, and between all that chanting, stirring mash and tending yeast, you head back inside now, warmth returning to your limbs, and take one last glance at the rows of barrels, lined up like soldiers waiting for inspection. There's peace here, and purpose, and perhaps just the faintest buzz. So tonight, as you drift further into the slow hum of sleep, remember this. Not all loopholes are lazy. Some are elegant. Monks didn't break their vows. They brewed around them. And in doing so, they created something enduring, something sacred, something very nearly a meal. The bells toll again this time for matins, those haunting early morning prayers meant for the truly devout or the truly awake. You're neither really, but you shuffle through the cloister anyway, your feet brushing the cool stone floor. Your belly still holds the warmth of last night's liquid bread. And now, as soft candlelight flickers through the abbey's arched windows, you begin to notice something else. This entire place runs like clockwork. Sacred clockwork. The monk's day isn't just ordered, it's orchestrated. And Beer has a time and place in that sacred schedule, too. You pass by a tall wooden plaque mounted on the refectory wall. It isn't decoration. It's the daily timetable etched carefully in Latin, and full of intimidating names like prime, terce, none. Every hour accounted for, every silence observed, and nestled into the rhythm like a monk among brothers, is brewing, under the rule of Saint Benedict monks, were commanded to live a life of ora et labora, prayer and work. You might imagine that work meant gardening or copying manuscripts, and yes, it did. But brewing was very much labor, and it fits seamlessly into the daily monastic grind. So imagine this. You rise before dawn, chant in the chapel until your voice croaks like a sleepy raven, then move directly into mashing barley. No complaints, no shortcuts. Just devotion, both spiritual and malt-based. You find yourself now in a small side room, the Braukeller, the dedicated brewing cellar. It's quiet here as always, but the stillness isn't lifeless. It hums. There's a heat in the walls, a comfort in the routine. A monk hums softly as he stirs a thick mash with a paddle taller than you. His face is calm, focused. This, you realize, is prayer, with grain. The rule didn't just allow for this, it almost encouraged it. Because work wasn't merely tolerated, it was holy. Brewing required discipline, timing, attention. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't improvise it, not without ruining a week's worth of grain, and maybe upsetting half the abbey. Historians still argue whether monks were consciously fusing their labor with their liturgy, or if it just worked out that way. But you watch now as the brewing process flows in perfect step with the rhythm of bells and incense. You wonder if the monks timed their boils to the hour prayers stirred between chants, blessed their barrels with whispered Latin. Not every order brewed. Carthusians, for example, leaned more towards silence and solitude, but Benedictines, oh, they brewed. So did the Cistercians, and later, the Trappists, masters of quiet fermentation. These weren't just occasional hobbyists. Some abbeys brewed more beer than they ever drank, distributing it to pilgrims, travelers, and even nearby villages. It was a sacred service. You lean against a barrel stamped with a faded sigil, crossed tools, maybe a mash paddle, and a shovel, wrapped in a vine of hops. It's beautiful in its simplicity. And it says, more than any sermon we work, we brew, we pray. Outside the garden is misty with morning dew. A small group of monks gathers around the herb beds, harvesting yarrow and fennel. These aren't just seasonings, they're ingredients. Early monastic brews didn't taste like modern beer. They were wild, herby, sometimes sour, occasionally strange. A record from one 12th century abbey even lists dandelion and nettle as flavorings. Another, mentions lavender. You imagine the first monk who said, "Let's put flowers in this," and see what happens, and then picture his brothers blinking over the mug like unsure dinner guests. But trial and error was part of the process, and unlike the outside world, monks had time. No rush. Just iteration. One quirk you'll love: some abbeys used a sort of proto-spreadsheet. Wooden tablets or waxed parchments listed brewing quantities, storage durations, and most charmingly tasting notes. You imagine a monk scribbling batch 7 less sour than Brother Anselm's personality, and tucking the note away like a little secret. You return now to the refectory where breakfast is being laid out. Just bread, cheese, and a light beer called table beer or taffel beer. It's barely alcoholic, closer to kombucha than your average pub pint. But it's comforting, familiar, part of the rhythm. And here's something curious. Many monasteries developed specific hand signals for common activities, so the silence of meals wouldn't be broken. One of those signs, a subtle gesture that meant, "More beer, please." Efficient, reverent, and maybe a little cheeky. You sit at the far end of the bench and sip from your mug. The monks don't speak, but their movements are peaceful. No hurry, no rush. This is a world in balance. Brewing isn't separate from devotion, it's woven into it. Stirring is meditation. Fermentation is faith. Somewhere nearby, Brother Linus walks past, balancing a small wooden tray, with a new sample for the abbot's approval. He gives you a quick wink, rare but telling. Perhaps this batch is a little stronger than usual. Perhaps it's the feast day of St. Gallus, who allegedly blessed wild geese, and may or may not have liked a good dark ale. And as the sun peeks through the high windows, casting warm light over the smooth grain of the wooden tables, you realize that monastic beer wasn't just survival. It was spiritual sustenance, a ritual in itself, a routine that nourished both the body and the soul without ever breaking a vow. The day has warmed. You step outside the abbey's stout stone walls, into the courtyard where chickens peck indifferently at the gravel, and bees hum lazily over lavender. Somewhere nearby, a hammer taps rhythmically on wood, perhaps a novice repairing a cask or carving a spigot. You follow the sound. In a low, timbered outbuilding behind the granary, the air is heavier, warmer. It clings to your skin with the scent of roasted grain and something else yeast, alive, invisible, and utterly essential. Welcome to the place where magic happens, where sugar becomes spirit, and monks walk the fine line between biology and theology. Welcome to fermentation. But here's the kicker. They didn't know what yeast was. You lean over a low vat, where yesterday's boiled mash now sits open to the air. A thin layer of foam gathers at the surface, bubbling faintly. No microscopes, no petri dishes, no sterile labs. Just wooden barrels, wild air, and the quiet confidence that if God wanted beer to ferment, he'd send the right invisible helpers. And he did. Sort of. Early monastic brewers relied entirely on spontaneous fermentation. Yeast floated in on the wind, settled on their tools, clung to their clothing. It was everywhere, and yet utterly mysterious. They called it goddess good in some parts of medieval Europe, believing it to be a divine gift. Others thought fermentation was driven by the stars, or by specific chants whispered during brewing. And really, who's to say a well-placed amen didn't help? Historians still argue whether monks ever consciously cultivated yeast by reusing successful mash, or if it all just happened through trial and holy error. What's clear is that over time they learned the rhythms. The best barrels, the cleanest rooms, the right time of year. They may not have known why a brew went sour, but they knew when it would. And that, honestly, is half the battle. You walk past racks of drying herbs, mugwort, juniper, chamomile. The monks used these not just for flavor, but to balance fermentation. Before hops became the dominant bittering agent, these herbs kept bacteria at bay, and added character, sometimes wildly so. One old recipe calls for a handful of heather and a pinch of soot, which may explain why Brother Linus occasionally looks like he's holding back a sneeze during tastings. You sit now at a long table, where a few bottles rest in straw cradles. These aren't glass, not yet. Just ceramic flasks, sealed with wax or wrapped in linen. Each is marked with a symbol, rather than a name. A fish, a star, a cross. You reach for one labeled with a crescent moon. A nearby monk, eyes twinkling, nods. It ferments by moonlight, he says. Is he joking? Hard to tell. But you uncork it carefully and take a sip. It's lighter than the last brew, floral, with a hint of lemon balm. Strange, subtle, delicious. And here's a fun detail. Many abbeys believed that fermentation was influenced by the heavens. Some brewed only during certain phases of the moon. Others refused to ferment during eclipses. And still, others sang specific hymns while stirring, believing the vibrations helped encourage the spirit. You imagine a room full of monks humming in deep baritone around a vat, and somehow it doesn't feel silly at all. You glance back toward the brewing vat. It's bubbling more now, a rich foam curling up around the edges. The monk stirs slowly, methodically, and occasionally sprinkles something into the mix, dried rose hips. A mystery. But he doesn't check a thermometer or glance at a clock. He knows it's time because it feels like time. Brewing by intuition, by prayer, by patient repetition. The room is thick with humidity. You fan yourself with a linen rag and peer into another barrel, this one sealed with a heavy wooden lid. Fermentation takes days, sometimes weeks, depending on the strength of the beer and the temperature of the room. The monks would check on it daily, whispering prayers, recording notes, and sometimes just sitting quietly watching it bubble, as if it were a living creature, which, in a way, it was. One story you overheard claims a monk once swore he saw a small demon rise out of a ruined brew, frothing hissing and shaped vaguely like a goat. Another version says the demon offered him a sip before vanishing. More likely, it was just spoiled yeast and an overactive imagination. But then again, after 3 pints on an empty stomach, who's to say? You step back into the light, blinking. The monastery hums around you. Chants drift on the breeze. The fields stretch outward golden and lazy, and you realize how little the outside world touches this place. And yet, in that quiet, isolated space, monks were perfecting an art. Not for fame, not for fortune, but because the rhythm of brewing matched the rhythm of their lives. Fermentation, after all, is patient work. It rewards stillness, observation, and humility. And those just happen to be monastic specialties. You sit now on a bench beside the garden wall. In your hand, a fresh cup of ale, cloudy and warm. You take a sip and close your eyes. The sun rests on your face, and the foam lingers on your lip like a mustache made of prayers. You feel it, the yeasty miracle of transformation grain to sugar, sugar to spirit, spirit to peace. Not everything needs to be understood to be holy. You're seated now in a narrow study, lit by a single shaft of sunlight, piercing the high, grimy window. Dust dances in the beam, like tiny monks at play, and the air is tinged with old parchment wax, and a hint of malt still clinging to your robe. Before you lies a curious sight, a stack of thin wooden tablets, each lined with neat Latin script and smudged thumbprints. This isn't scripture. It's beer math. Yes, monks kept records obsessively. So, brewing wasn't just sacred labor. It was documented labor. Each batch, each modification, each hiccup of fermentation was noted like a confession. If you're imagining medieval spreadsheets, you're not far off. You run your fingers over the grooves of a wax tablet, where someone likely Brother Petrus, judging by the marginal doodle of a frowning barrel, has etched details: date, grain ratio, amount of water used, even an observation about frothiness. You smile. It's comfortingly mundane. This isn't divine intervention. It's trial and error, carefully written down, so the next brother doesn't ruin 100 weight of barley. Historians often describe monasteries as the first bureaucratic breweries. Some even argue that without monks, the tradition of systematic brewing might have faded into chaos. And sure, there were brewers outside the cloister walls, but monks had something others didn't: time. Lots of it. Time to track, compare, refine, and to write down exactly how many stirs a perfect mash requires. And that brings you to a charming quirk: the monks loved measuring things. Not just barley and hops, but the number of boils, the weight of added herbs, the minutes between steps. While the rest of the medieval world might be guessing at recipes, monks were experimenting with consistency. You flip another wax sheet and discover a tiny drawing in the corner, a beer barrel with wings. A joke, a warning. Maybe Brother Petrus had a playful side, or maybe someone had a bit too much of batch 14 that day and decided barrels could fly. It happens. The Abbey's brewing notes often mixed technical detail with personal flair. One record lists, too warm. Sourness likely. Brother Matthias fell in. You hope that's metaphorical. Another mentions new batch strong. Do not serve to the bishop. Definitely not metaphorical. You walk now toward a side chamber with stone shelves holding long, narrow scrolls bound in leather. These are the old logs, the big ones, the brewing annals. Some abbeys kept records going back a century or more. They documented not just recipes, but grain deliveries, weather patterns, changes in yeast quality. You realize flipping through one such scroll that you're not reading a recipe. You're reading a memory. One scroll in particular catches your eye. It details a harsh winter 1316, perhaps. The harvest was poor, water sources froze solid, and the monks turned to their beer reserves for survival. They rationed barrels like precious relics, giving thicker brews to the sick and elderly lighter ales to novices. Beer wasn't a luxury that year. It was the backbone of the monastery's survival plan. You picture Brother Linus standing watch over the last barrel like a sentinel. No chance. Just quiet vigilance and maybe a silent prayer for early thaw. And here's another fringe theory for you. Some researchers believe that monks deliberately cultivated yeast by smearing successful brews onto cloths and hanging them above the next batch. No microscopes, remember, but you don't need a PhD to notice when something just works. Whether they realized it or not, these monks were creating early starter cultures, proto-yeast labs, in damp cellars. You return to the scriptorium where a monk is carefully copying a recipe onto sheepskin. Not a Bible, not a sermon, just a beer log. and you realize something important. They weren't just preserving scripture. They were preserving systems, taste, technique, time. Recipes handed down across generations, tweaked and perfected by men who may never have spoken aloud during meals, but could communicate everything necessary through ink and observation. And let's not forget the labels. Yes, even back then monks were thinking about packaging. Casks were marked with symbols. A cross meant blessed beer. A sheaf of barley indicated strength. A fish, ironically, sometimes stood for not suitable for fasting. You find one marked with a grinning face, and wonder if that batch had extra warmth. Later on, as some abbeys began bottling for outside use, labels grew more ornate. Illustrated saints, gilded Latin scrolls, and even warnings like for pilgrims only appeared. It was early marketing cloaked in reverence, but for now you sit back at the desk, holding one of Brother Petrus's wax tablets. You try to picture him bald, ink-stained, maybe humming, as he writes slightly sweeter than usual in Latin shorthand. A man of devotion? Yes, but also of process. A man who brewed like others painted icons. You close your eyes. The room is still. The warm scent of yeast and smoke wraps around you like a heavy robe. Somewhere nearby, another batch begins to bubble, and another monk sharpens his stylus for notes. Numbers, ratios, scribbles in margins. This too is prayer. The rain begins without warning, soft at first like whispers against stone, then steady and unrelenting. You watch from the doorway of a side chapel, the courtyard beyond turning to wet cobblestone as the sky bleeds gray. The abbey doesn't pause. Monks move calmly under cloaks, their sandals slapping quietly through puddles. And down in the lower corridor, past the herbarium and the kitchens, something else continues uninterrupted, the gentle clink of mugs. You follow the sound drawn deeper into the belly of the monastery, until you reach the tap room. Yes, a tap room. Monks didn't exactly call it that, of course. Too worldly. But even sacred spaces need somewhere to store barrels and pour out samples. You duck through a short doorway and are greeted by a room lined with kegs, stone benches, and an atmosphere heavy with history and mischief. Because here's the thing, monks didn't always toe the line. You sit beside a barrel, stamped with a faded symbol, likely a heraldry mark. Or maybe just Brother Petrus getting decorative again and taken the room. It's darker here, more private. You can imagine this is where the strongest beer was kept. The batches too bold for fasting days. The celebratory brews. The indulgent, nearly sinful ales poured on feast days, or occasionally on feast days no one else knew about. Historians still argue whether monks secretly hoarded stronger beers for themselves, or simply miscalculated a little too often. Accidental over-fermentation seems to have happened with suspicious regularity. And here comes the scandal. You open an old cabinet and find a thick ledger. Inside, delivery logs, guest names, even consumption tallies. But something catches your eye. An entry marked only with a small red circle. A code. A. Warning. A mark of shame. You turn the page and find more similar circles this time, with notes like over-poured at Vigil Bro. Anselm too loud at Compline, and Abbot received second cup did not refuse. These aren't mere errors. They're moments, human ones, where rules blurred and lines shifted in the flickering candlelight of temptation. Even monastic discipline had its cracks. One tale scribbled in the margin tells of a monk who became a local legend for secretly tapping the feast day barrel a week early and blaming the noise on the goats. Another story, more whispered than written, claims that a certain monastery in Flanders kept a hidden keg behind a false wall, accessible only by those who knew the knock and prayer. You can't help but smile. Saints sure but flawed ones, human, thirsty, tired, monks who got cold, lonely, or just fed up with Lent week 3 and decided to open the strong stuff. One fringe tale, unlikely but delightful, tells of an entire cellar walled off after an especially potent vintage caused the choir to accidentally sing the Easter hymn during Epiphany. Whether the incident was divine misdirection or barley-fueled time travel, no one can say. You take a cautious sip from a pewter cup nearby. This one bites. Strong, sweet, with a warming kick that spreads like a slow sunrise through your chest. Definitely not for fasting. You imagine this might be the batch marked only for abbots and emergencies. And what about guests? Yes, abbeys had them. Pilgrims, bishops, visiting nobles. Hospitality was sacred, and the beer served to guests often outshone the monk's own supply. You can't offer holy water when someone's traveled 100 miles on foot. You offer ale, generous, golden, and brewed without the austerity of spiritual restraint. Sometimes the monks drank with them, quietly, respectfully, and sometimes not so much. Records from one French abbey detail a visiting priest so thoroughly refreshed by monkish hospitality that he slept through 2 whole prayer cycles and accidentally wandered into the goat shed wearing someone else's habit. Still, most monks remained within bounds. The majority drank moderately, if at all, and kept their vows with stoic grace. But the presence of scandal of sin peeking through gives the whole place a kind of honest glow. Not every cask was sacred, not every brother was perfect, and that somehow makes it all more believable, more human. You walk now into a smaller chamber tucked behind the taproom. It's little more than a stone closet, lined with bottles, scrolls, and cobwebs. A secret stash, a forgotten archive. You light a stubby candle and find more notes, recipes scribbled without Latin flourish logs, without names, drawings of barrels surrounded by tiny stars. You're not supposed to see this, are you? This is where the unofficial stuff went. The tweaks, the experiments, the indulgences not meant for public prayer or script, a place for creativity, perhaps even confession. One bottle here is labeled only Avebach. Another, do not serve to leanness. You chuckle quietly and sit. The candle flickers. The rain still falls. You take another sip of the strong brew and feel the world soften around the edges. The chants, the discipline, the rigid hours, they're still real, still sacred. But within them, between the cracks, lives the laughter of real men. Men who sometimes poured a second cup. So yes, there were sins. Little ones. Human ones. And they lived like yeast, quietly in the dark, bubbling just beneath the surface. The rain clears by mid-morning, leaving the stones slick and shining, like they've been polished by invisible hands. You walk along the cloister again, this time toward the east wing, where steam curls upward from a squat chimneyed building. The scent changes as you approach less barley, more herbs, more mystery. You're about to enter what might be the abbey's most experimental chamber. This is the brewhouse's secret twin part, laboratory part kitchen, and part apothecary. It's where monks turned beer into art, or depending on the batch-mild chaos. Welcome to the cloistered chemistry lab. Inside, a long table is cluttered with mortar and Pestle's dried leaves, bundled with string beeswax candles, stubbed into wine bottles, and a great ledger left open in the middle of a page marked winter formula, strong warming, do not repeat before spring. You peek over the monk's shoulder. Brother Theodoric may be judging by his robust eyebrows, and see he's preparing a new addition to the brew, dried orange peels, wild thyme, and a suspiciously large handful of juniper. He doesn't look up, just gestures to the bubbling pot as if to say it's watching. Be polite, because while the monks were orderly and prayerful, they were also curious. Curious enough to test different grains, oats rye spelt, and substitute hops with whatever was in season. Not every experiment succeeded. One note in the ledger simply reads, bitter, terrible, blame Brother Wilfrid. And then there were the honey ales. You take a seat on a barrel as a monk brings over a dark bottle sealed in wax. It's labeled with a little b and the year 1324. He uncorks it with care. The scent drifts toward you thick with clover and wood smoke. You sip. It's smooth, almost syrupy, and warm in a way that makes your shoulders loosen. Mead and ale blended like a hymn and a drumbeat. Some monasteries were known for these sweeter brews, made not just for nourishment, but to soothe the sick, warm the old, and occasionally charm a visiting bishop. Though no official recipe remains, rumors persist of healing beers infused with rosemary and poppy seeds. Sleepy monks indeed. Historians still argue whether these herbal experiments were health-focused, taste-driven, or just desperate attempts to use up surplus garden herbs before winter. Some even believe certain batches were semi-psychoactive, hallucination-inducing ales, accidentally served during fasts. The records are vague, but the drawings in the margins, dancing monks, floating chalices, one highly questionable fish in a bishop's mitre, suggest someone had a good time. You walk through the storage vault, next where ceramic vessels sit in neat rows. Some are stoppered with wax, others with cloth tied in string. One is labeled Thistle Plus, Heather, do not shake. You don't. Brother Linus reappears holding a pair of wooden mugs. Spiced for the cold, he whispers, offering you one. It's darker than usual with a reddish hue. The first taste is sharp ginger and black pepper, then settles into something comforting, like a memory of warmth. This wasn't brewed for ceremony. This was brewed for December, for aching joints, for evenings when the cloister wind howled like a penitent ghost. A surprising number of old monastic recipes list ingredients we now think of as seasonal treats. Cinnamon cloves, nutmeg when they could get them. Imported spices were rare and expensive, often brought by pilgrims or traders, who knew that monks paid well in ale, not coin. And it wasn't just flavor. Some monks believed spices enhanced the spiritual experience. A touch of clove could sharpen the mind for prayer. A hint of cardamom might ward off melancholia. Whether these beliefs were rooted in observation or superstition, it didn't matter. The brewing continued. The batches evolved, and the formulas became tradition. You rest on a low stool and glance at the blackboard hanging near the back door. Today's experimental brew is called Herba Sancta Niger 6. The notes say no mint this time, slightly less burn. Watch for side effects. You smirk, because monks, for all their reverence, weren't afraid of mistakes. Every failed experiment was simply one step closer to a miraculous brew, and sometimes those mistakes became legends. One abbey's most popular winter beer supposedly began as a ruined Groot batch, accidentally left to ferment with apple peelings and dried plums. The result, a fruity, spicy concoction that warmed even the coldest hermit. The recipe, Lost forever, of course. You return to the main table, where Brother Theodoric is now bottling the newest creation. He dips the necks in beeswax one by one, sealing each with the abbey's sigil. You watch, mesmerized by the rhythm, the care. Not rushed, not sloppy, just patient, just quiet. And here's something curious. Many abbeys added marks to their bottles, scratches, stamps, even tiny wax symbols, not just for organization, but to track aging. Some monks believed certain brews improved over months, even years. Whether the science supported that or not, the ritual did. Aging beer became a form of anticipation, a calendar in liquid form. As you finish your mug, the warmth settles into your bones. The spiced ale lingers on your tongue. The candles flicker low, and you realize that this strange, herbal, barley-sweet world wasn't just about survival or sanctity. It was about curiosity, about crafting something imperfect, earthy, and deeply human, something that could, with the right care, become holy. By late afternoon, the abbey glows with the lazy warmth of golden light, filtering through high stained-glass windows. Dust hangs in the air like suspended incense, and the hum of daily labor slows. But down in the stone-arched storerooms, the heartbeat of the monastery thumps on steadily wooden mallets, tapping barrels, corks popping gently, ledgers flipping. You're about to see how beer didn't just sustain monastic life, it bankrolled it. Yes, beer paid the rent. The room you enter now smells like oak ink and something faintly metallic. Rows of barrels line the walls, stacked 3 high, each stenciled with neat symbols. A monk nearby is making entries in a fat ledger, his quill dancing like a spider's leg. You peek over his shoulder, dates quantities and destinations. One batch to the hospital, another to the bishop's manor, and a few barrels labeled Pilgrim Stock Low Strength. Because monks weren't just brewing for themselves anymore, they were brewing for the world. Over time, monasteries began producing far more beer than they could possibly consume. And while they didn't technically sell it, for money was sticky business. Under vows of poverty, they distributed it widely. Pilgrims, visitors, the poor, the sick. Anyone in need might find nourishment in the abbey's ale. But let's not be naive. Bartering was common. Monasteries might trade beer for grain tools labor, or more beer. In some towns, abbey-brewed ale became currency in its own right, used to grease political wheels, or win the good favor of influential neighbors. It was, in essence, holy liquid economics. Historians still argue whether monastic beer trade was benevolent charity or clever capitalism in a cassock. But records from several abbeys show consistent exchanges barrels, marked with different value levels, coded seals indicating quality, and notes like "Send to Duke," with blessing and extra mug. You step into a side room filled with donation boxes, some heavy, some empty. Nearby, a monk packs a few flasks into a padded chest. For the hospital, he murmurs without ceremony. You follow him across the courtyard past the chapel and out through the side gate. A small building squats near the abbey walls, simple but clean, with beds for the sick and weary. Here, monks use their beer not as sacrament, but as salve, because monastic beer was more than just refreshment. It was medicine. High-calorie, mildly antiseptic, and easy on sore throats. Some batches were specially brewed for invalids weaker, with added herbs like calendula fennel or chamomile. You see one patient being offered a pewter cup. He sips slowly, eyes closed, shoulders, relaxing. And then there were the feasts. Every monastery had them saints' days, holy days, days when the strict rhythm loosened just enough for laughter. On those days, the best beer came out. Rich, dark, heavily spiced. You find a note on the wall in the monk's kitchen reserve, the St. Martin's barrel for November. Next to it, someone's drawn a cartoon goose wearing a mitre. You sit on a low bench near the loading area, where a donkey cart is being filled with sealed jugs. A small crowd has gathered outside the gate. Local villagers, some with baskets, others just waiting with mugs in hand. One by one, they're given their share. Not every monastery was so generous, but here, the distribution is done with quiet grace. Brother Linus appears beside you, handing you a mug with a quiet nod. This one paid for the roof, he says. You look up. The tiles gleam in the fading light. A new roof bought not with coins, but with cups. In some regions, abbeys became the center of the local economy. Farmers sold barley directly to monasteries. Cooperages thrived making barrels. Towns built roads to speed the delivery of holy brew. One Benedictine record even shows a special brewer's blessing offered annually to traveling merchants, probably in exchange for safe transport, and maybe a keg of imported something or other. There's a story, probably apocryphal, that one abbey was nearly excommunicated for selling too much beer to a rival cathedral's stonemasons, whose productivity allegedly declined due to excessive monastic hospitality. Whether true or not, the point stands beer wasn't just sustenance or ritual, it was infrastructure, and sometimes it was politics. You walk into the abbot's quarters, where a long scroll hangs from the wall, a list of patrons, supporters, bishops, and nobles, who've been blessed with select brews over the years. A few names are underlined. One has a little halo sketched beside it. The abbot catches your eye and smiles. He helped fund the bell tower, he says. Then tapping another, she gave us beeswax for 5 winters. It's not cynical. It's reciprocal. Monks gave beer. The world gave back. And through this quiet exchange, abbeys grew. Chapels were restored. Gardens expanded. Guest quarters improved. And more importantly, the beer kept flowing. Back in the cellar, a new batch is being sealed. You run your hand along the smooth barrel top, feeling the cool, damp wood. A small tag dangles from the rim. For the orphanage blessed batch. You breathe in the scent, sweet grain, sharp hops, and something else, something warmer. In this abbey, beer wasn't just brewed. It was shared, given traded. A sacrament not only of faith, but of community. You return to the outer cloister, just as the evening bell rings, echoing across the stone courtyard like a hollow drum roll. Shadows stretch long across the gravel walk, and beyond the gates you see them gathering townsfolk, pilgrims, traders, all waiting at the edge of sacred space, their eyes occasionally darting toward the windows, glowing with candlelight and the towering silhouette of the abbey itself. They've come for prayer, perhaps, or healing, or maybe, just maybe, for a taste of the monk's fabled brew, because by now word has spread beyond the monastery walls. The beer here isn't just holy, it's good, better than what's served in the taverns, cleaner, more consistent, less likely to make you see the Virgin Mary juggling bread loaves on your 3rd mug. And that's where things get complicated. You watch as Brother Linus opens the gate to greet a small delegation travelers from the nearby town. They're polite, reverent, but also eager. A leather pouch exchanges hands. Not coins. Something more subtle. Maybe beeswax, maybe a bolt of cloth, maybe a whispered promise. Moments later, a cask is carried discreetly toward their cart. The label reads, Guest brew moderate strength, blessed on Ascension Day, because now the townsfolk want in, not just to taste the beer, but to make it, to profit from it, to imitate it. You pass through the gate and walk down a narrow dirt path that skirts the village. Its humble mud walls, thatched roofs, uneven cobblestones, but right near the market square, there's a new structure going up. A brewery. Secular. Loud. Smelling of smoke and ambition. Inside, a man with soot on his cheeks is stirring a great pot. The recipe, unclear. The inspiration, obvious. A crude drawing of a monk holding a mug is scratched into the wood over the hearth. The kind of wink that says we know who taught us. Historians still argue whether monks welcomed this imitation or quietly cursed it under their breath. Some records show abbots cooperating with local brewers, sharing methods, even offering surplus yeast. Others paint a more tense picture, with lawsuits filed over monk-branded beer sold at rowdy fairs. One abbot allegedly stormed a town tavern, demanding the return of a stolen cask, and left with a barmaid's apron wrapped around his head. Probably apocryphal. Probably. But there's no denying it, the beer was out of the cloister. You return to the monastery, where a new batch is being tested. Brother Theodoric eyes narrowed sips from a ladle and frowns. Too sharp, he murmurs. Not enough steeping. He jots a note in the margin of a weathered logbook. Town copycats lack patience. You nod. Brewing isn't just ingredients. It's rhythm. The tempo of bells. The breath between prayers. And that's what the townsfolk often missed. Secular breweries eager to meet rising demand rushed their batches. Skipped steps. Boiled too hot. Bottled too soon. They used barley mixed with cheap fillers' oats, wheat rye husks, sometimes even beans. Anything to bulk up the mash. One enterprising brewer reportedly used breadcrumbs soaked in rainwater. The result? A brew so sour it was used as paint thinner by accident. Still, the towns pressed on. Beer brought income, status, and imitation brought innovation. Some towns began experimenting with new methods, new spices, and yes, even better cleanliness. One particularly industrious village created a filter system using sheep's wool. Effective if slightly unsettling. Monks watched all this with equal parts admiration and apprehension. Their beer had become a model, a legend, and now a brand. Not by design, but by inevitability. One abbey started engraving tiny crosses onto their bottle corks to prove authenticity. Another sealed their barrels with red wax that left a distinct fingerprint on the hand. You see one such barrel being loaded for delivery, now marked only to be opened within sight of the abbot. Good luck enforcing that. And here's a detail that might surprise you: some monasteries actually licensed their beer to townsfolk under strict contracts. You read one such agreement scratched onto calfskin parchment: 1/3 of all profits to be donated to the Abbey of St. Bernardus. All barrels must bear the image of St. Radegund in smiling profile. No use of frogs, jesters, or other secular imagery permitted. You can almost hear the argument now. But Brother Linus, what if the frog is smiling in reverence? No, Brother Petrus. That's a tavern mascot. The answer is still no. You sit again in the warm hush of the Abbey's taproom. The candles burn low. A fresh cask has been opened this one darker fuller, and brewed specifically for internal use. You sip. It's richer than anything the townsfolk are making. Still sacred, because the monks know something others forget. Beer isn't just about flavor. It's about care, stillness, respect for the process. and perhaps a touch of mystery. The world outside may brew louder, faster, flashier, but in here, under stone arches and patient chants, the real thing continues, quietly, faithfully, froth by froth. Twilight deepens across the fields, casting the abbey's stone silhouette into a world of long shadows and soft gold. You find yourself walking the worn path that leads from the guest house toward the edge of the forest. It's lined with flagstones, some cracked, some mossy, all shaped by centuries of pilgrim feet. Because that's who comes here now, pilgrims. Not just to pray, not just to rest, but also, yes, to sip. You pause at the gatehouse as a group of travelers arrives. Their cloaks are dusty, their eyes tired but bright. They've walked miles, days even. One clutches a carved wooden staff with a scallop shell tied to the top, a symbol of pilgrimage. Another carries a small flask strapped across her chest, battered and dusty, but unmistakably marked with the emblem of this abbey, a loaf of bread hovering over a mug of ale. Pilgrim branding circa 1320. Hospitality is sacred, and the monks honor it not just with shelter, but with ale. You follow them into the guest refectory. It's smaller than the monks' dining hall, but warmer. A hearth burns low, and the long table is set with loaves of dark rye bowls of lentils, and a few carefully poured mugs. No feasting, but no fasting either. The beer here is light, small beer brewed with less grain, and fermented for shorter time. Enough to warm, enough to soothe. And more importantly, safe. The pilgrims eat in silence at first. Then as the ale warms their bellies, quiet, conversation blooms like ivy along the stone walls. Gentle stories, soft laughter, a whispered prayer of thanks. It's not a tavern, but the feeling isn't far off. Camaraderie forms quickly over shared miles and shared mugs. You sit among them listening. One traveler, a flaxen-haired boy from Bruges, tells of a monastery he passed, where the beer was sour and the monks stern. Here, he says, raising his mug you can taste kindness. The monk serving the beer, Brother Matthias, wide-shouldered and soft-eyed nods solemnly, and adds just a splash more to the boy's cup. No charge, no thanks needed. It's part of the rhythm, but it's not just kindness. It's economy. Pilgrims bring news goods, and occasionally donations. In turn, they receive rest food and beer that doesn't make them see God twice. Many abbeys began expanding their guest quarters, even building small roadside chapels with microbreweries attached. The medieval version of a drive-through, except holier and much, much slower. Some monks viewed this growing network of pilgrims and pints as a kind of sacred exchange. Others were wary. Historians still argue whether abbeys like Cluny and Melk welcomed this open-door policy, or grumbled as their sacred silence was drowned by cheerful clinking. You step outside once more and walk toward the stables. The wind carries the sound of evening bells and faint laughter from the pilgrim quarters. Nearby, an old wooden sign sways in the breeze. Beds and blessings. The paint is faded, but the intention still clear. And yes, pub envy was real. Local taverns began to notice that travelers preferred the monk's beer. Cleaner, safer, more reliable. Some inns tried to replicate the flavor. Others straight up lied. In one case, a tavern just outside Ghent put up a sign reading monk, beer approved by God. The abbey promptly sent a letter, and possibly a strongly worded prayer. A fringe record claims one landlord disguised himself as a monk to smuggle out brewing secrets. He lasted 3 days before he was caught falling asleep during vigils. His penance, 4 months cleaning barrels, no tasting. You continue along the garden wall, where a tiny door opens to a side shop. It's unmanned, but a slate board invites pilgrims to leave a few coins in exchange for a flask of Pax Brew. The flasks are squat and wrapped in twine, each bearing a different Latin blessing: Pax Vobiscum, Vita Brevis, Fermenta Aeterna. You take one, because even now, centuries later, those flasks become tokens, keepsakes of the journey. Abbey beers weren't just beverages, they were souvenirs, stories you could sip, a miracle bottled. Some monasteries even engraved names onto mugs for frequent visitors, a kind of early loyalty program. One monk reportedly remembered over 200 regular pilgrims by their preferred beer and bench. Brother Alphonse knew more about human nature than most bishops, one record reads. He could tell a liar by their second sip. You find a quiet bench near the fish pond, the flask cool in your hand. The sun has dropped fully now, and the stars begin to claim the sky. Behind you, pilgrims settle into sleep. Inside the abbey, Compline begins soft chants rising like mist. And here, in this soft silence, you understand the brilliance of it all. The monks didn't set out to build a tourist industry, but by brewing with care, by sharing freely, and by allowing their quiet excellence to ripple outward, they built something enduring, something that quenched more than thirst, a network of hope hops and hospitality. Twilight deepens across the fields, casting the abbey's stone silhouette into a world of long shadows and soft gold. You find yourself walking the worn path that leads from the guest house toward the edge of the forest. It's lined with flagstones, some cracked, some mossy, all shaped by centuries of pilgrim feet, because that's who comes here now, pilgrims. Not just to pray, not just to rest, but also, yes, to sip. You pause at the gatehouse as a group of travelers arrives. Their cloaks are dusty, their eyes tired but bright. They've walked miles days even. One clutches a carved wooden staff with a scallop shell tied to the top, a symbol of pilgrimage. Another carries a small flask strapped across her chest, battered and dusty, but unmistakably marked with the emblem of this abbey, a loaf of bread hovering over a mug of ale. Pilgrim branding, circa 1320, hospitality is sacred, and the monks honor it not just with shelter, but with ale. You follow them into the guest refectory. It's smaller than the monks' dining hall, but warmer. A hearth burns low, and the long table is set with loaves of dark rye bowls of lentils, and a few carefully poured mugs. No feasting, but no fasting either. The beer here is light small beer, brewed with less grain, and fermented for shorter time. Enough to warm, enough to soothe, and more importantly, safe. The pilgrims eat in silence at first. Then, as the ale warms their bellies quiet, conversation blooms like ivy along the stone walls, gentle stories, soft laughter, a whispered prayer of thanks. It's not a tavern, but the feeling isn't far off. Camaraderie forms quickly over shared miles and shared mugs. You sit among them listening. One traveler, a flaxen-haired boy from Bruges, tells of a monastery he passed, where the beer was sour and the monks stern. Here, he says, raising his mug you can taste kindness. The monk serving the beer brother Matthias wide-shouldered and soft-eyed nods solemnly, and adds just a splash more to the boy's cup. No charge. No thanks needed. It's part of the rhythm, but it's not just kindness. It's economy. Pilgrims bring news goods, and occasionally donations. In turn, they receive rest food and beer, that doesn't make them see God twice. Many abbeys began expanding their guest quarters, even building small roadside chapels with microbreweries attached. The medieval version of a drive-through, except holier and much, much slower. Some monks viewed this growing network of pilgrims and pints as a kind of sacred exchange. Others were wary. Historians still argue whether abbeys like Cluny and Melk welcomed this open-door policy, or grumbled as their sacred silence was drowned by cheerful clinking. You step outside once more and walk toward the stables. The wind carries the sound of evening bells and faint laughter from the pilgrim quarters. Nearby, an old wooden sign sways in the breeze. Beds and blessings. The paint is faded, but the intention still clear. And yes, pub envy was real. Local taverns began to notice that travelers preferred the monk's beer. Cleaner, safer, more reliable. Some inns tried to replicate the flavor. Others straight up lied. In one case, a tavern just outside Ghent put up a sign reading monk beer approved by God. The abbey promptly sent a letter, and possibly a strongly worded prayer. A fringe record claims one landlord disguised himself as a monk to smuggle out brewing secrets. He lasted 3 days before he was caught falling asleep during vigils. His penance, 4 months cleaning barrels, no tasting. You continue along the garden wall, where a tiny door opens to a side shop. It's unmanned, but a slate board invites pilgrims to leave a few coins in exchange for a flask of Pax Brew. The flasks are squat and wrapped in twine, each bearing a different Latin blessing: Pax Vobiscum, Vita Brevis, Fermenta Aeterna. You take one, because even now, centuries later, those flasks become tokens, keepsakes of the journey. Abbey beers weren't just beverages. They were souvenirs, stories you could sip, a miracle bottled. Some monasteries even engraved names onto mugs for frequent visitors, a kind of early loyalty program. One monk reportedly remembered over 200 regular pilgrims by their preferred beer and bench. Brother Alphonse knew more about human nature than most bishops, one record reads. He could tell a liar by their second sip. You find a quiet bench near the fish pond, the flask cool in your hand. The sun has dropped fully now, and the stars begin to claim the sky. Behind you, pilgrims settle into sleep. Inside the abbey, Compline begins soft chants rising like mist. And here, in this soft silence, you understand the brilliance of it all. The monks didn't set out to build a tourist industry, but by brewing with care, by sharing freely, and by allowing their quiet excellence to ripple outward, they built something enduring, something that quenched more than thirst, a network of hope hops and hospitality. Morning mist clings low to the grass as you wander into the scriptorium again, though today it's different. There's something new in the air, a kind of gentle pride, humming just beneath the silence. You follow the faint sound of scraping quills and paper shuffling until you come upon a table that gleams with unexpected color. Scrolls, parchment labels, and wax seals, everyone covered with flourishes of ink and little logos. Yes. Welcome to the world of divine branding. Because once monastic beer began to reach beyond the cloister walls, it needed a way to say, this one is ours, and not just to the nose or the tongue, but to the eyes. Hence the rise of symbols, saint seals, and slogans. A young monk brother Hugo, judging by the tiny H he's doodled in the margin of a parchment, sits hunched over a row of hand-cut bottle labels. Each one bears the abbey's seal, Of course, a sheaf of barley wrapped in a vine of hops. But there's more. A motto carefully painted in gold leaf. Laborare est orare. To work is to pray. It's a fitting slogan for a beer made by calloused hands and whispered hymns. You pick up one of the labels and trace the delicate lines. There's an image of St. Gallus mug in one hand, crozier in the other, smiling benevolently beneath a Latin arch. Gallus ale, it reads in neat block script, followed by blessed by tradition since 1113. You chuckle. That's about as close to a commercial as the Abbey's going to get. Historians still argue whether these embellishments were meant as pure devotion or proto-marketing. Some scholars insist that monks saw the labels as an extension of their spiritual message. Others suggest they knew exactly what they were doing, and why Brother Hugo spent 3 weeks deciding whether St. Benedict looked better with a halo or a hop garland. Because like it or not, branding had arrived. You leave the scriptorium and find yourself in the Abbey workshop, where wooden mugs are being carved with quiet precision. One monk dips a hot iron into a barrel and then brands the base of each cup with the Abbey's initials. Another sands down the rim until it's smooth as a prayer stone. These aren't for the monks. They're for guests, pilgrims, even dignitaries. And over time, some of these items, mugs, flasks, even wax-sealed documents, began to circulate far and wide. Little emissaries of the Abbey's quiet reputation. You open a drawer marked keepsakes and discover a small pendant shaped like a tiny beer barrel. On the back, Benedictine Blessing, 1291. Was it worn by a grateful pilgrim, given as a token of peace? Dropped during a particularly spirited feast day. Even more elaborate were the hand-painted bottle stoppers made for feast day ales. You examine one ceramic glazed in blue, with a cross molded into the top. It's stamped with the words, Vivat Fermentum. Long live fermentation. Brother Linus appears chuckling as he sees you examining it. That batch caused reflection, he says. You raise an eyebrow. Too strong, he shakes his head. Too cheerful. Took us 3 hours to sing Compline. No one could stay on pitch. And then there were the seals. Red wax for Lent ales, white wax for festivity batches, black wax rare for memorial brews, made when a revered abbot passed. You find a black wax bottle in a velvet-lined box, untouched, bearing the name Abbess Machelius. There's a hush to it, a reverence that no label could fake. Even the fonts were selected with care. Certain monks specialized in calligraphy and were tasked with designing the look of each brew's script. Cursive for herbal ales, Gothic block for Trappist-style brews. One particularly ambitious monk tried to inscribe a full psalm onto a bottle label. He succeeded barely. The bottle had to be nearly a liter to fit it all, and of course, word of mouth helped. Monasteries known for their particularly smooth or spiced beer began drawing larger crowds, longer lines. The Abbey of St. Norberta. Yes, their winter brew tastes like salvation. No, you want the mint-blessed batch from the Hilltop Priory outside Regensburg. That one tastes like angels doing cartwheels. Naturally, competition emerged. Friendly mostly, but intense. One abbey began wrapping its bottles in linen dyed with saffron. Another carved tiny crosses into the corks. One very bold monastery added a tiny bell charm to each bottle, with the cheeky slogan, Ale worth waking for. You walk now into the cellar, where rows of crates are prepared for delivery. Each is stamped with careful branding, burned symbols, handwritten notes, and tucked scrolls. It's all a little theatrical, but also deeply sincere, because this isn't just about selling a product. It's about crafting an experience. From the first glance at the label to the final sip of foam, the monks believed the process should be mindful, reverent, and if possible, beautiful. And so their branding became more than marks and mottos. It became a language, a liturgy of taste and touch, a way of saying, this is made with care, this is made with purpose, this is made with love. You lift a bottle with a copper wax seal, turn it in your hand, and catch the faintest scent of spice through the cork. You don't even open it. You don't need to. Sometimes a glance is enough to know the spirit within. A cold wind rolls in overnight, and by dawn, the sky hangs low, swollen with gray. The bells ring slower this morning. You wrap your robe tighter and walk toward the cloister's back garden, where frost etches silver outlines along the withering leaves. The earth is hard, the air bites, and for the monks it means more than just layering wool. Winter is coming, and with its scarcity, this is when the abbey's beer matters most, not as sacrament, not as hospitality, but as survival. Down in the brew cellar, the activity is quieter now, more cautious. You descend the steps slowly, each footstep echoing against damp stone. The air is thick with smoke and sour grain batches from the last warm days, fermenting slowly in great casks. The candles are fewer, the prayers longer. This is brewing by instinct now, not schedule. A monk kneels beside a barrel, adjusting a cloth stopper, whispering something beneath his breath. A blessing, or a simple reminder not to overfill again like last December, when a batch froze solid and cracked the cask wide open. Because yes, beer could freeze, especially the thinner brews, and with frozen barrels came waste risk and hunger. This is the season when brewing slows, or stops entirely. In some abbeys, winter meant relying entirely on what had already been made. Stronger beers were hoarded marked with red paint or wax stacked deep in underground cellars, where the cold couldn't reach them. Lighter beers, if any remained, were rationed, given only to the sick, the elderly, or those brave enough to rise for vigils when the rest of the world slept under snow. You walk through one such storage room now, torches flickering against the hoarfrost, dusted along the stone walls. Each barrel is stamped with a date, some with initials, others with warnings, not to be opened until Candlemas, reserved for Lent, Brother Lucian's batch. Caution spirited. You smile. Even in scarcity, humor survives. Historians still argue how much brewing continued during harsh winters. Some sources suggest monks stopped altogether, unable to maintain the heat necessary for fermentation. Others claim winter ales, often stronger and spicier, were not only brewed, but prized, believed to offer inner fire during long, bitter nights. And then there were the outside forces: plague, war, famine. You see evidence of it in the records barrels left untapped as communities quarantined, entries scrawled hastily. Batch spoiled, no salt left for cleaning. Guests turned away, keep gates shut. In some abbeys, beer became a form of defense. During sieges, monks offered it to guards, to soldiers, even to their besiegers. One tale, half fable, half truth, tells of a monastery that survived a winter raid not through swords, but by rolling out a barrel of double-strength porter and inviting the enemy to share. The monks watched from behind stone walls as drunken mercenaries fell asleep in the snow. No blood spilled, just frost and foolishness. You sit now on a low bench near the hearth, where a pot of porridge bubbles quietly. A small mug rests nearby, just a splash of ale served warm. It's darker than usual, with notes of clove and roasted chestnut. You sip. It burns gently on the way down, but the warmth spreads fast. This is winter beer, not the bright, bubbly drink of festivals. This is bread you can drink with your gloves still on. You glance at the wall, where a carved wooden plaque displays the Abbey's winter ration schedule. It's simple 1 mug per day for novices, 2 for elders, 3 for those who work in the outer fields, who split wood, who break ice before sunrise. Each monk's name is listed in chalk beneath their allocation. Brother Linus has 2 marks. Brother Petrus, who walks with a cane, has 3. 1 faint mark is smudged, wiped away. Perhaps someone didn't return from a journey, or perhaps someone gave their share to a visitor. In times of hardship, beer wasn't indulgence. It was a kindness, a small promise that warmth would return, that flavor could still live, that even in the dead season fermentation was waiting, silent, patient, alive. And not every abbey endured. You wander now through the ruins of a neighboring monastery, swallowed by creeping ivy and snow. The walls are crumbled. The bell tower is gone. But in the remains of the cellar, you find them broken barrels, their hoops rusted, the wood splintered with age. A few moss-covered stones still bear scorch marks where fires once heated mash pots. Here brewing ended not by choice, but by force. The Black Death, perhaps, or a forgotten war, or maybe the slow suffocation of a dwindling order. But somehow their beer lived on. A note carved into the cellar wall reads, "Our hands are gone, but the yeast remains." A poetic flourish or a literal truth. Either way, you breathe it in cold, damp air, scented with distant malt. You wonder, did a young monk flee here with a flask of starter culture tucked into his robes? Did a single recipe survive, scribbled onto the back of a psalm? You like to think so, because beer has a way of surviving, in warmth or cold, in feast or famine. It adapts. It waits. It rises again when conditions are right, much like faith, much like hope. You walk back to the living abbey, where light glows in the windows once more. Inside, monks sip quietly, their mugs steaming gently in the flickering firelight. Outside, frost curls over the barrel hoops. Inside, the yeast sleeps ready to wake with spring. The brew may slow, the chants may lower, but the spirit never freezes. It's spring now, at least the kind monks recognize not by flowers or birdsong, but by the smell of barley warming in water again. The air has softened. The ground, no longer frozen, welcomes footfalls, instead of echoing them. You walk once more into the abbey's inner yard, where monks have shed their heavy cloaks and returned to their more nimble rhythms. And in the cool but sunny morning light, the brewhouse door stands open. Inside, the barrels breathe again. You pass Brother Linus as he rolls out a fresh cask, muttering to himself, not prayers, not exactly, but that quiet, practiced language of the brewer. Not too quick, not too soon. Let it sit. Let it speak. He gives the wood a knock with his knuckles, listening to the hollow thrum like a doctor checking a heartbeat. The monks have survived another winter. Scarce barrels are now blessings. And yet you can feel it in the air. Something has changed, because not every monastery remained untouched. Plague had thinned the ranks. War had shaken alliances. Entire orders had scattered. Some brothers never returned, and their brews like their beds now sat untouched. Recipes were lost, scrawled in half-filled logs. No one could read anymore. Yet others curiously endured. You sit beside a warming mash pot and watch Brother Theodoric flip through an old ledger. He's frowning, running his finger along a nearly faded line ale for the widow's feast use remaining apple peels. You ask if the recipe still exists. He shrugs. Half of it, maybe. But the memory brews itself, and in that sentence, everything clicks, because monastic beer wasn't simply preserved in pages or barrels. It was carried, quietly, by those who remembered, by those who left. You stroll now through the guest house, where a small group of lay brothers has gathered men, who once wore robes, but now wear common clothes. They left the order years ago for reasons not discussed. Some to help family, some to pursue other callings, some simply to breathe outside the walls. But they brought the beer with them. Historians still argue which famous secular breweries trace their lineage back to cloistered walls. Some names are suspiciously close to known abbeys. Some brewing styles down to the herbs used in the second boil mirror, those in lost monastic notes. Coincidence or quiet legacy. One story tells of a novice who fled a collapsing monastery during the 30 Years' War with nothing but a cloak, a flask of yeast, and a single wax tablet tucked in his sleeve. He became a brewer in the next town. His grandchildren founded a tavern. The house ale to this day is served with a prayer. You find yourself standing in the abbey's archives now, where bottles from centuries past line one dusty shelf. Each is sealed. Each bears a name, some familiar, some long forgotten. One labeled simply St. Odilo's last batch is wrapped in oilcloth untouched. Another is signed not with a name, but with a musical note. A brother who wrote psalms better than he wrote words. Even the yeast tells a story. Modern brewers have discovered strains, preserved in old monastic bottles living cultures, that survived sealed centuries. When reawakened, they bubble to life like they never left. It's as if the monks themselves are still brewing invisible, but ever present. You walk through the garden, where hops stretch eagerly toward the sun, coiling around trellises with fresh, green urgency. The vines were cut back during winter. Now they return fast, vibrant, insistent. A lesson from the plants themselves: nothing good ever really disappears. It simply waits. A monk passes carrying a new batch toward the cellar. You catch a glimpse of the label modern parchment, modern ink, but the words are old Salvator, resurrection batch. A nod, perhaps, to both Easter and fermentation. One rises from the tomb, the other from the barrel. The abbey hasn't changed, but the world around it has. Fewer monks, fewer visitors. Still the barrels roll, still the mash stirs, and somehow the beer remains. You settle into a sunlit alcove with a fresh mug. The brew is mild, slightly nutty, with a floral hint of spring blossoms and rosemary. It tastes like sunlight on stone, like parchment warmed by a candle, like time remembered, because this more than anything is what survives the ritual, the repetition, the grace of patience. Brother Linus joins you raising his cup. It's not the strongest batch, he admits, but it's honest. And it is, because what endured wasn't just the yeast or the ledgers or even the labels. What endured was the spirit, a way of moving through the world with care and quiet and purpose, a way of transforming the humble into the holy, a way of brewing that outlasted the brewers. Evening falls again slower this time, the sky dimming like a wick turned low. You find yourself back in the cloister's heart, surrounded by soft lamplight and the fading fragrance of warm grain. The abbey has settled into its quiet rhythm once more. Bells' footsteps, soft chants drifting up like smoke, and the beer, as always, breathes silently in the dark. You're holding one last mug, the final sip of a long journey. This one tastes different. Not sweeter, not stronger, but fuller. There's something in it that stretches back through every chamber, every page of Brother Petrus's logs, every drop ladled by candlelight into a cold pilgrim's hand. It's memory, it's continuity, it's the aftertaste of devotion. You're seated now in the oldest part of the cellar, a place rarely visited even by the monks. The floor is uneven, cobbled with mismatched stones, and the walls sweat faintly in the candle glow. Barrels surround you like ancient companions. One is cracked, one leans, but most still hold steady, sealed by hands, long gone marked with signs only the devout or the stubborn can decipher. You run your fingers over one barrel in particular. The carving reads simply, Frater Morus, 1178. No recipe, no boast, just a name. A man who once stirred, prayed, sipped, and recorded. A monk like dozens before and after him. A brewer of discipline and faith. This was the last sip of his last batch, and you've just joined the line of those who came after. Because what the monks created quietly, diligently, and with often wobbly Latin, wasn't just beer. It was a practice, a rhythm of work that carried them through plague, war, scarcity, scandal, and reform. And yes, it slipped now and then. A stolen sip, a secret keg, a special batch for the bishop's visit. But through it all, it held fast. Brewing didn't save the church. It didn't halt the tide of time, but it offered in its small, patient way a sanctuary. And now, centuries later, we drink not just the ale, but the silence that came with it, the honesty, the effort, the peace in repetition. You stand and stretch. The stone beneath your feet is cool, but not unfriendly. You leave your empty mug on the ledge, where others have done the same, and make your way back toward the staircase, past barrels that exhale faint trails of clove and pepper and thyme. Above the abbey sleeps, but below the yeast still dreams. The echoes of the abbey fade now gently, like a bell toll carried off on a slow wind. You feel the quiet settle around your shoulders, like a heavy wool cloak, scratchy, but warm, woven from ritual and reverence, and the sleepy rhythm of 1,000 prayers whispered into steam. The monks return to their cells. The barrels rest undisturbed. The ledgers close. And the yeast. It works silently in the dark, transforming grain and water into something more than sustenance. Something softer. Something shared. Outside the garden sighs under moonlight. The vines curl in upon themselves. The hops are still. Even the wind tiptoes now. You find your breath growing longer. Your thoughts slower. The details blur at the edges like ink bleeding on old parchment. That cold mug, the flicker of candlelight, the low hum of monks lost in chant. They linger not in focus, but in feeling. There's no need to remember everything. Just remember the warmth, the quiet, the care. Let it settle like sediment in the bottom of a well-poured glass. Let the noise of the day drop away, leaving only calm and stillness, and maybe the faintest trace of rosemary on the tongue. Sleep now, And if you dream, let it be slow and amber-colored, like holy beer, brewing. Still,